I know that guy.
Today is Monday, November 17th, 2014. We're here for the purposes to meet as the Committee of the Whole. It is 8:20, and I would ask Clerk Spencer to call the roll. Please call the roll.
Dutenhoff.
Here.
Joyder.
Here.
Dunn.
Here.
Leader.
Here.
Polumsky.
Here.
Graham.
Here.
Saludo.
Here.
York.
Here.
Levin.
Here.
Healy.
Here.
Onquist.
Here.
Kennedy.
Here.
Mulliner. Wagner.
Here.
12 present, 0 absent.
12?
Did I say that right? I'm sorry, 14 present, 0 absent. I wondered why the long silence.
14 present, 0 absent.
I'm sorry.
We are in session. Any announcements? Seeing none, we'll move on to public comments. Clerk Spencer, is there anybody who has signed up for public comment?
Yes, we have 2. Claude Pagash, 566 North Gladys.
Okay, public comments. I think everyone who was in the audience here was the same folks that were here for our meeting about 10 minutes ago. I would ask that you keep all of the same requests and rules in mind. And if you go over your 3 minutes, I will give you a gentle reminder. Mr. Pagash, the floor is yours.
I haven't listened to all the budget meetings, but a majority of them. I find it interesting that one group that has appeared before this council can do without less. You all need more. Interesting, isn't it? The public out there hasn't had decent raises in about the last 8 or 9 years. But the city and every branch of it needs more. We talk about Han. We talk about a parking garage. I don't hear the council members talking about a new food bank going in. The food bank is not going in because we are so wealthy. You all have families. Given a choice between paying increasing taxes for all the wants, what choice do you make when it comes down to taking care of your family or paying the taxes? Can't keep on going to the residents and saying you need more. And there's just a little failure going on right now. There was an article in the paper. There's been a rather large investment by this city that's an ultimate failure. You can't create TIFs and then give away the taxes. One alderman said we'd never see the property taxes, but at least we'd see the sales taxes. But you're giving those away. The residents have a finite limit of money. You may not believe it, but they do. And you're breaking them. And everybody that needs money needs more, not less. And then they have funds they just happen to find that the council knows nothing about, will never know anything about, and the money is spent, but they still come for more. You can't keep on giving more when the public as a whole is making less and less. Now, you all may just be making a great deal of money, but that public out there isn't. And we're not building food banks because we're prosperous. And a high school is not helping students out because their parents can pay to get them there.
Mr. Pagash, you're over your 3 minutes. I'd ask you to wrap up.
So before you just pass out all this money that everybody wants, just remember your family, and if you don't have the money, and then you make the choice of who you give the money to.
Tamara Brenner.
Tamara Brenner. So I was looking through the items that are going to be rediscussed tonight, and of course the electronic underpass banner sign came back up, which I remember commenting on some prior year of kind of a frivolous use of taxpayer money, I thought, and I still think that. Apparently from the paperwork that's been generated by the city manager, there's a real interest on the part of the city to have this thing, but I don't think the justifications are really there in this letter. It does say that the most important issue is safety. I think the safety issue is being overstated. Obviously, there's been no accidents. It says that there's been no accidents claimed. There are a lot of dangerous jobs in the world that get done with precautions to make them safe. And I think that's what's been done here. You're doing a good job keeping this safe, even though it's got some inherent danger because gravity does exist. Also, we've got a concern about near misses due to distracted drivers on their cell phone and texting. Well, drivers on their cell phone and texting are a risk for everybody on the road, not just the guy parked to change these banners. And if people are doing that in the city of Elmhurst, then our police force might be stopping them a little more frequently. It talks about the financial pieces of it, saying that we're paying 2 employees at 2 to 2.5 hours, and we're using 2 trucks. That is true, and if we have an electronic sign, we're still going to be paying 2 employees and using 2 trucks. The city's not going to be saving that money. They're going to be, unless they're paying these guys overtime for these 2 to 2.5 hours, the city's not going to save that money. They're still going to be spending the money, so I don't think it offsets the cost of the electronic signs. Talking about the administration charges increasing. You can increase the administration charges regardless of whether you're using electronic or manual signs, and you should increase it. It seems like $35 is pretty cheap. You've raised every other fee. Why are only charging $35? But that's not going to defray the cost of the new sign either. You could increase the cost, the administrative cost now, and save money over buying the electronic sign. It talks about city messages and alerts can be simultaneously put up there with the banner information. This includes things like flooded underpass. Really? We're going to put on the electronic sign that the underpass is flooded? Pretty sure we're going to know about that before we get to the sign. Oh, and about distracted driving, changing signs are probably just as distracting, or a potential distraction as much as anything else causing safety issues. The last thing on here, the signs could be designed to allow for advertising of local Elmhurst businesses. I am certain that when I talked about this the first time around, the one thing I emphatically said was, I do not wish to be advertised to with an electronic sign on the underpass. I still don't wish to be advertised to, and if we have to use advertising money to pay for the electronic sign, we really can't afford it. I hope you guys will just take this small item out of the budget. The banner signs are actually a nice touch for the town, and I hope we keep them that way. Thanks.
Okay, Clerk Spencer?
That is all that signed in tonight.
Okay, is there anybody else who did not have an opportunity to sign up on our sign-in sheet that wishes to address the council with regard to our budget this evening? Seeing none, we'll move on. Business before the council. Well, I think the council's aware we did get through everything last week, November 10th, and we're beginning our circle backs. As I've said with previous budget discussions and previous budget meetings, my target and my hard stop is 10:30. If we don't get through all of our circle backs this evening, we have plenty of time between now and the end of the year to have another meeting. The hope during the circle back process is that we address any questions that any alderman may have expressed or have provided any additional information as requested. We will entertain motions and be taking votes to change specific line items should any alderman or aldermans choose. That having been said, I think everyone is in receipt of the circle back recap from Director Gaston, dated November 13th. These are not in order, they are within the budget, but they are in order with which the council presented the questions to staff. Any questions before we get started? All right, then we are going to, and if you know, certainly just because it's on here doesn't need to be discussed if your question was answered in any of the attachments or information provided. So with that introduction, we're going to go to number 1, Mr. Grabowski, page 166, Elmhurst Historical Museum. Several attachments and questions. Do you have anything you wish to set up?
Other than what you said, that we've taken the city council's questions, we've delivered all the information to either answer the question or have additional conversation, and we welcome that now.
Okay. Any questions or comments or additional conversation as it relates to anything related to the Elmhurst Historical Museum? Alderman Healy?
Thank you, Mayor. Okay, so I've got a few questions, but I want to preface this, and I see some members of the Historical Commission in the audience, excuse me, the Historical Foundation. Again, my comments are specific to the museum and not the foundation and all the good work that the foundation is doing. Specific to the strategic plan, I think, I know I was a little surprised, pleasantly so, to hear that the strategic plan would be finished sometime in Q1 of 2015. And talking to a couple of my fellow aldermen, I think they were as well. As for the process itself, can somebody fill me in a little bit on the focus groups, who was included, were elected officials included in the focus groups, were residents included? Can somebody fill me in on the process?
Sure, I'm happy to answer the question about the makeup of focus groups. Those focus groups took place late last fall, and they were conducted by the two facilitators, Ken Bartels and Larry Carroll, who are helping us with development of the strategic plan. At the time, we had invited city council members to provide names of individuals who might participate as focus group members. We also reached out to a number of selected individuals, community leaders, school leaders, and so forth. And then we also compiled a list of just more than 100 names, random names really, from the museum guest registry, names with Elmhurst addresses. And those individuals were invited by letter to participate in the focus groups.
And what kind of response did you get from that? How many people were involved in the focus groups?
I believe we had maybe 3 or 4 different groups. They were relatively small, ranging from 3 or 4 individuals to 9 or 10. I was somewhat disappointed by the turnout. Nonetheless, the feedback was very positive. We used the feedback as a check to the development of the plan to that point, and the information in most instances was reassuring in the direction that the staff and the members of the Heritage Foundation who are serving on the planning committee were directed towards. And we agreed, coming out of the focus groups, that we would continually check back to that feedback that was given through the focus groups to make sure that we're not missing anything as we proceed through the development of the plan.
Okay, and that's occurred, the continuous feedback to these residents and stakeholders has occurred?
We have not provided them any additional information at this point yet.
Okay, and when would you expect to do that, given that Q1 of 2015 is the stated goal for completing the process?
As we wrap up this last element of the 4 strategic issues in the plan, we'll be sending it back.
Okay, so a couple questions then on the 4 areas. And obviously, I've got a interest in revenue generation and seeing the museum become more self-reliant upon revenues generated from museum operations. So by that, I mean excluding foundation grants or state grants, but actual revenue generated by people coming and going through the museum, opportunities that may exist with the community, et cetera. Where, if anywhere, in the strategic plan will that be addressed, and how much work has been done on that subject to this point?
Well, I'd like to say that to address the Heritage Foundation, which you brought up, they've been a great group and provide a big piece of the pie for revenues for the Historical Museum, as you all know, through the capital campaign. And the revenue pie really includes the things that the Heritage Foundation are doing, as well as those things you identify, Alderman Healy. It's one big pie. And the revenue that we'll be raising through the city is addressed in the final section, section 4, excuse me, on page 6. You'll see item D near the bottom of the page. As part of our branding, marketing, and communications section, a number of topics have been identified, including program fees and admission fees, and that has ranged from discussions about what are appropriate fees. Should we be simply covering the cost of a program, or should we be recovering additional revenue off of a program? With admission fees, some of the discussion has centered on whether or not, for instance, Elmhurst residents should be charged, as well as non-residents, procedures for administering that type of fee or collection at the gate, the rentals, specialized services, include things like charging for reference services. As you know, through the monthly report that I prepare, the museum receives typically 700 to 900 reference inquiries each year, and providing that service to residents as well as non-residents is part of the cost that's built into the museum. So we're looking at that. There's also the opportunity through the gift shop to recover funds through the sale of merchandise that's directly related to the collection. For instance, reproduction photographs. We already do that. If you go into, I believe it's both jewel markets, the Schiller Street as well as the South Jewel Market, you'll see photographs from the museum collection. So we have a fee policy in place for reproduction of photographs, and that ranges from use for educational purposes to use for commercial purposes, and we'll be looking at that policy as well. So those are the areas that we'll be looking at for revenue.
So would it be your expectation that when the strategic plan is complete, that those areas you discussed and potentially a couple additional ones will be fully fleshed out and stated as part of the plan? Or more specifically, will it be your expectation that the plan include I'll call it a percentage of self-sufficiency, that it's the museum's goal to be 5%, to generate 5% of its annual operating budget via revenue from operations? Again, not foundation, but revenue from operations. Something along those lines. Is it your expectation that the strategic plan will contain that information?
Well, I think that type of information would be built into the annual budget process. We would set goals for programming, fees, for museum store revenue, that type of thing.
Alderman, if I can add, the way that that we've been heading, and I think it was in the beginning of Brian's memo, was that there are some smaller group discussions that are happening right now to put together the action plan. And that's where you would see those details, not necessarily in the strategic plan as far as what revenue specifically can we generate, but as Brian pointed out on that page 6, it addresses some areas where we need to discuss that to see what an admission fee would be, what a reference fee would be.
So
see where that
would you
lasts.
expect to have that action plan, I think is the term used, would that action plan be completed as well in Q1 of 2015?
Either within that first quarter, or certainly by the second quarter.
Your Honor, if I may, just a few additional questions on revenue. So switching, now I know we've talked a little bit about revenue. Is that something that staff feels is important and vital to the museum's success? Or is that contrary to the museum mission? Or, you know, what, I'd like to hear some conversation from staff on actual revenue generation and some outside-the-box thinking, some marketing opportunities. I know other aldermen have feelings on marketing opportunities. What's staff's stance on revenue generation?
I would start by saying that at any department of the city, revenue generation is important. I'm certain I can turn to my right and get a confirmation on that. Looking at the museum in this light is new to us, and we're understanding what you're saying, and so I think we've put significantly more effort into that response this year than any other year, and so yes, it is important to us to start generating more revenue, at least to analyze what revenue can be generated and then implement that.
Alderman Gutenkopf?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So along these lines of revenue generation, do you have an estimate of what percentage of a department's budget any department generates through these sorts of earned income opportunities? And I ask this question because when I really drill down into the museum department's budget, when you peel back staff salaries and you peel back the interdepartmental charges for IT, we're talking an operating budget of $231,000. It's clearly the smallest budget of the city. And so I'm wondering how much of the fire department's budget they have to generate, how much of the police department's budget we're expecting them to generate, how much of the building maintenance, building facilities services department, how much they have to generate. Granted, you know, generating revenue is a really important component of the city. I am concerned that since city residents already pay taxes to the museum, and I certainly have heard this from residents, they don't expect to also pay additional fees to use the services. I mean, there's sort of a built-in expectation that I shouldn't have to pay additional fees to get reference services because my taxes are supporting the city and the city supports the museum, it's a department of the city. So back to my original question, do we have a ballpark percentage of a department's budget we're expecting a department to generate? Or corollary to that, how much they really are bringing in revenue?
We don't have those numbers tonight.
Is it realistic for me to expect that it would be possible to have that as part of this discussion, or perhaps that becomes one of the measures of the strategic plan for the museum is to fall in line with general revenue expectations for other city departments?
Those are numbers we could generate. I don't know how much time it would take to generate it with
Well,
great
the reason
accuracy.
I'm,
Well, let me put it this way, Alderman Gutenkopf. I think we get your point
thank you,
without asking staff to put in a couple hundred hours to get to your point.
don't want to do that.
I understand. I think everyone's clear on your point, and if not, I can further clarify, but I think I know where you're headed with that one. So let's call them rhetorical questions.
Thank you.
But you get the idea. Any other comments as it
Mayor
relates?
Morley, if I could, I'd also like to, again, refer back to the earlier strategic plan that we're extending through this work that we're doing right now. And that earlier strategic plan had not ignored the revenue side. As a matter of fact, it focused quite a bit on growing revenue for the Elmhurst Historical Museum. And considerable work and time and effort has gone into growing those revenues. And that was identified in the strategic plan as the Heritage Foundation's role, to bring in private funding. So I'm not saying that it's ignoring the revenue generating opportunities that are at hand at the Historical Museum, but our earlier plan did focus on taking an organization which was somewhat moribund at the time and growing it here in just 5 short years to have a membership program, to have an annual fund program, to be wrapping up a $300,000 campaign that's going to result in a new exhibit in the Historical Museum, and to having really an active, effective fundraising organization. And our next step with that organization is as well to grow our opportunities with planned gifts and memorials. All of those things take time. They don't happen overnight. But the staff and I have been working diligently with the Heritage Foundation to accomplish those types of things over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. And I know the staff also shares the interest in pursuing other revenue generating. And as City Manager Grabowski said, we've heard that this is a direction to take, and we stand ready for the challenge.
Alderman Gudenkauf.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think it's worthwhile to review a little bit about how museums raise money and where their money comes from. And I think that Mr. Berghager has hit those really important points, and perhaps we had to sort of back up a little bit, because it's really critical that we all understand that the museum, and this guided by the City Council, has a fundraising arm. So we can't take out of the equation the foundation's financial contributions to the museum. So where do museums get money from? They get gate fees. Gate fees typically don't account for much of an operating budget. You're lucky if you get 20% of your total operating and capital budget coming from your gate fees. They get profit on goods sold. The Historical Museum doesn't have a very large shop space. We're not going to realize a ton of profit on goods sold. You pretty much have to have a full-time store manager to make real money from that. I mean, somebody whose whole job it is to run your shop, to really build it up. Memberships. Huge percentage of museum funds come from members, because members get converted to donors. And that, in the city of Elmhurst, is a big piece of the role of the foundation, is those kinds of annual asks that we all get in our mailbox this time of year. You get one from any nonprofit that you're affiliated with, and that is how museums raise money. Some are lucky enough to have facilities that they can rent and generate some rental fees, or they've got food service facilities where they can earn money from banquets that are now unrelated business enterprises that put you into a whole different tax category. So, how do museums get money? Exactly the way the Heritage Foundation has been raising money for the museum. So the fact that we're challenging them to raise more money, I think, is missing the whole point of what's happened in this organization of the last 3 years. They've turned around completely. We've challenged them to do something that they're now doing, that now we sound like we're berating them for not doing enough. I just don't think we're recognizing the considerable effort that they put into to raise the money to do the new exhibit, which will then generate new energy and new interest in this really vital part of our community. So While I certainly appreciate that we should always be looking for new ways for the museum to raise money, we cannot discount the fact that they're doing exactly what we charged them with. And they have been raising money. It doesn't show up in the city budget because we have an affiliate organization that is able to do this on their behalf so that those donors can realize tax deductions from donating to a nonprofit. And that's a really critical reason why donors give. They give because they like things, but they also give because there's a tax incentive for them to do so. The foundation has been set up to offer them that opportunity. Let's not discount those efforts.
Alderman Deuter.
Thank you, Mayor. Question, the earlier strategic plan from 2005 is organized, it seems to be organized around 3 essential questions. One of them is operational capacity. Will this new strategic plan have some type of focus on, say, you know, I like the phrasing, but it has a lot of really good questions within it, and I like that idea of the focus on organizational capacity. I don't see it in here, but I'm wondering if it might be in the final version.
Well, the operational capacity is an interesting feature of that earlier plan, because along with the feature of a new building, a new facility, the Elmhurst Heritage Foundation, I think that operational capacity shared equally. Through that planning process, we identified the opportunity for a new facility in Elmhurst. And you have to remember, this was at a different time in the economy. And there was a lot of excitement around the idea of a new facility. We were looking at locations. We were talking about capital budgets. But we also recognized that the museum at that time did not have the operational capacity to operate a new facility. It simply wasn't there. And so that earlier plan identified a number of features related to operational capacity. And though I may say with hindsight that that earlier plan was flawed in identifying a new building that never happened, I wouldn't say it was a bad plan, because the operational capacity feature is what we've continued to implement out of that plan over the past 4 years or more. You know, we've grown our marketing. We cross-market with the other museums. We work with City Center. We work with the Chamber. We also identified the need to step up our exhibit program. All of you are aware of the exhibits that are now done at the Historical Museum. We're devoting more resources to exhibits. That was intentional. That's part of the operational capacity. The Heritage Foundation was another part of that operational capacity. We needed private funds in order to operate a new facility. And even though a new facility is not on the table, all of those items, or most of those items that were identified as operational capacity builders, continued to be considered on an annual budgeting process. And that's the direction that we continued to work. So when we came around to a new strategic plan, we went back to the previous plan. We actually spent quite a bit of time identifying the accomplishments that came out of that new plan. We had several pages. The staff compiled that. We shared that list with the Board of Directors of the Heritage Foundation. And by and large, there weren't too many differences of opinion about what had been accomplished in those areas of operational capacity. So as we further got into development of a new strategic plan for the museum, we agreed as a planning group that our approach would be to extend that plan. We weren't going to approach our chore as creating a new plan, but we're really extending a lot of the material that was in that previous plan. And that has taken the form in the draft plan of those 4 strategic issues that are identified. But a lot of the discussion continues to center around that very term of operational capacity.
Alderman Bram?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just want to say, like I said last time when we touched on this topic being the Historical Museum, is that I have been impressed with what was a challenge from the city council at the time, I would say 3 to 5 years ago, and what I've seen the museum do in those 3 to 5 years, stepping up to the plate and making significant, what I would deem at least, to be significant improvements. The biggest thing is the exhibits. I don't want to go into detail, but those exhibits being brought to other museums to be shown, like the City of Chicago, for instance, is a feather in our cap. And I want to give kudos where kudos are due, especially for that area of significant improvement. Now, with that said, I will say that, you know, as long as I sit up here, I have in the past had, I guess, a little bit more detailed of an eye on the museum in regards to the costs and what revenue the museum generates and what is the product that the museum offers. As I've just stated, it's, I believe, significantly improved. But that doesn't mean that, you know, we should lower the bar. I think we need to continue to challenge, at least from my perspective, I will continue to challenge the museum, as well as the foundation and everyone within the city of Elmhurst, to continue to try to make as much of an effort to generate as much revenue as possible to assist the city of Elmhurst as a whole / taxpayers with the operating costs of the museum. One of the things I mentioned last time was wages versus the other operating costs. The wages in general is a significant portion of the budget for the Historical Museum. I didn't ask for a response then, I won't ask for a response now on that, but that's something I think that the museum needs to continue to look at and see on how we can do better. How we can do better from the standpoint of putting more of those dollars that the City of Elmhurst residents contribute to exhibits and continuing to better those. When we made this a circle back, one of the things that I asked for, or before that, in regards to, and I saw this on the strategic plan, but goods and selling goods for one part of the revenue, I was happy to see, you know, that we're moving to the direction, or the thought at least, of having an online store. As Alderman Gutenkopf mentioned, of, you know, one small piece of revenue is merchandise or goods sold. I think an online store for the city of Elmhurst would be beneficial. The questions for what I asked for was about the storage and collections. When I reviewed the information that was provided for that, I struggled to see, and maybe, Brian, you can clarify for me, what is the current philosophy of the museum on collections and storing of those collections? It seemed, at least to me, what I took away was it was a little bit vague. And we've talked about this in years past. We're spending $30,000+ on storage, and I'm not gonna challenge the lease. We're in the approximately, I don't know, the middle of the lease at this point. But having a 4,000, I think, plus square foot facility for our collections is something that, at least in my perspective, should be justified to make sure that we're keeping collections that are deemed appropriate for this type of museum. Some of the questions I had last time, and like I said, I didn't see answered, is how many items, approximately, not to the number, but how many items are in the museum storage facility? How frequently are these items used? How many new items are received per year? What percentage is kept? Do we actually dispose of items? In the plan, it's stated that once every 5 years, we do inventory. I'm not in this business, so I don't know if that's very frequent or infrequent, but to me, my perspective was it seems pretty infrequent that we don't know what our inventory is, except approximately once every 5 years for an accurate inventory. And then in the strategic plan, and I'm looking forward, as Alderman Healy stated, I was happy to hear that the strategic plan is around the corner because it mentions about the master facilities plan. I know that's mentioned in there and it's not gonna come out with the strategic plan. But I think all of these questions should be answered in this master facilities plan from my perspective, because I think we need to see if we can reduce the storage or keep some of the collections, or most, if not all of the collections, somewhere on site for currently owned Elmhurst buildings. So if we have any answers in regards to the storage, what do we take in every year, how much do we have, what is the philosophy of what do we say yes to and what do we say no to, that would be appreciated.
Sure. Well, collections are really central to museums. You know, that's the business of museums. And as an example, this new exhibit that will be opening in February will rely on the museum collection. Some of those things that have been in storage for a number of years will be brought out and they'll be shared in the exhibit. And those things, individual things in the collection, tell a story about the character of Elmhurst, about the challenges that people in Elmhurst face, about the rewards that people find in their everyday lives. And so it is central to what museums do, and museums continue to collect over time. As another example, the passage of time will give a different perspective on something that's in the collection. You know, at the time in 1987, during the floods, we collected some material related to the devastating flood that took place here. And those things look differently from a historical perspective today than they did in 1988. And they tell a different story because of the passage of time and the continued issue that stormwater and flooding continue to play here in Elmhurst. You also compare changes over time. We have things related to, for instance, the first police officer in Elmhurst. Those document the life of the city over time. And we would not necessarily decide to get rid of those, or as we term it in the museum business, deaccession those types of items. Over time, collections take different directions, and materials are deaccessioned. Most often, it's because something is no longer useful for research purposes or exhibit purposes. Maybe it's broken. But we do continue to collect, and I do want to stress that collections are extremely important to museums. That's the top priority that we share through exhibits. Our collections, they're kept for the community as part of the community. And we take in things passively by and large, although we do actively collect in some instances. We may have up to 100 to 200 different things in a year. One year we may have 50 things that are brought into the collection. The collection policy that was shared as an attachment identifies the process that the staff goes through to decide whether or not something is appropriate for accepting into that long-term obligation that we have with the collection. The other thing that I wanted to mention, that collection storage is an aspect of collecting that museums deal with, and I can acquire some information on comparisons to other museums, for instance, and the size of their collection and collection storage spaces, if that would be helpful.
I think that would be very helpful. I think the overall message I'm trying to communicate here is I don't view the museum storage space as an unlimited closet. I was trying to ask questions in that regard to understand on what is the view of the museum on how large that closet as our own personal space and our homes should be, or should that be an unlimited closet space where anytime we start to grow out of it, we continue to increase that. We are in a long-term lease, but that lease is gonna continue to increase every year, and I just wanna make sure that we're scrutinizing appropriately on what comes in and what items that we keep in our collections. Because that's one piece of the overall operating cost budget that I think could grow to be relatively significant in the years to come.
Anyone else who hadn't had an opportunity? Alderman Palomsky.
Thank you, Mayor. First, I want to thank Director Berghager for the information and the report and the additional information, and to the Heritage Foundation for all you do. I know the work you put in is not recognized to the extent that maybe it should be. The work you do with cultivating relationships, membership growth, and donations is much appreciated, so thank you. I have a question. I think start with saying that many of us up here hear concerns from people that we don't have a large daytime population downtown. Perhaps that can be measured, but with sales tax receipts, or maybe it's just looking around seeing that maybe with the hospital moving to the south end of town, we don't have as many people around the downtown area. And I'm curious, in looking at the summary of the strategic plan, it mentions regional exhibits, and it meant regional history, and also Elmhurst history. And I'm curious to know, how do you determine the balance of Elmhurst-focused exhibits and regional ones? And two, is part of the consideration the thought that the regional exhibits may bring more people into Elmhurst, and that could be beneficial to the city as a whole?
Sure. That issue was first addressed in the earlier strategic plan as part of our discussions on exhibits. And those of you who have been in Elmhurst for a number of years may recall an exhibit that the museum did coming out of that strategic plan. It was an examination of the 65th year, I believe, of, or no, excuse me, it was the 75th anniversary of Downbeat magazine, which is published here in Elmhurst and has been for a number of years. And we coupled that with a celebration of the Elmhurst College Jazz Festival. Both of those entities go beyond the political boundaries of Elmhurst. There's an interest in jazz and in Downbeat magazine that's national and actually international for the publication. And coming out of the strategic plan, we identified that we wanted to address more topics that had a broader geographical interest. And we wanted to identify Elmhurst topics that had regional interest. And I think that very first one that was identified, the Downbeat and Elmhurst College Jazz Festival, succeeded in that direction. And so everything we've done since that time has more or less grown from that. And to answer your question about dividing installations between Elmhurst themes and broader themes, the staff has ongoing discussions about what's appropriate for the museum, what's appropriate for Elmhurst, and what's appropriate for the city. And generally, we look to the summer as doing one of those broader themes because of the opportunity to attract visitors and tourists to the area who are traveling during the summer, to address caregivers with their children who have more free time during the summer. And it's reflected in our numbers over the summer. We have a spike in visits. It's not unusual to have individuals come from other communities, either by vehicle or by train, and do a daytime trip, spend time at the Historical Museum and other museums, and then dine in Elmhurst. So we also are committed to doing more specific topics, like the Carl Sandburg topic. And I'd like to think that the Carl Sandburg topic was not that dissimilar from Downbeat and the Jazz Festival, in that we looked at the 10 years that Carl Sandburg spent as a resident of Elmhurst, and using that as a backdrop to examine his life, his work. And of course, Sandburg has an interest that goes beyond the political bounds of Elmhurst as well. And I think we were pleasantly surprised by some of the interest that that exhibit generated. So I think that staff is always challenged to identify those Elmhurst topics that can be examined in a way that has broader appeal than simply Elmhurst residents. But we also do Elmhurst specific things. For instance, we're planning some architectural walking tours this summer, and our first line market for that will be Elmhurst residents, although visitors from outside of town, I think, will also enjoy the opportunity to learn about the architecture in Elmhurst, both commercial as well as residential architecture. But we try to balance our services, recognizing the needs of Elmhurst residents as well as our desire to attract people from outside of town.
Alderman Leader?
I just want to clarify the cost of off-site storage. I know when we talked about this, I was jet lagged. I was just back from a 4,000-mile flight. And is that the 6047 rentals on page 167? Is that the 43,900, pardon me? Is that the cost? I just,
Page again, Alderman Leader?
167. Line item
Yes, it is.
6047 rentals. I'm just trying to ascertain the cost of off-site storage.
Yes, it is.
So the cost, because Alderman Bram mentioned 30,000, so the cost in 2014 is 43,900, and in 2015 projected to 45,200, and in 2016 projected to 47,000. Okay, that's just wanted to clarify that.
Alderman Healy?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. First, I want to start with a couple points of, I guess, rebuttal or answering a couple of the rhetorical questions before I get to my final comments related to the museum. So pretty much by definition, the city provides services, so pretty much every department is an expense. Some departments are better off in being able to offset some of those expenses. You know, I think what the police department does with their asset forfeiture to be able to recoup some of their expense and buy equipment. The fire department with their wireless fire alarms. I mean, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but that's, you know, that's hundreds of thousands. So departments do have the ability to offset some of the expense. And I look at the museum certainly as one that should be able to do that, because they're already doing it now. I just think they should be able to do it a little bit better. The question was asked about museums and where do they get their revenues. In response to a question from a fellow alderman about museums of similar size, where do they get their revenues from? Staff responded that there are 13 museums in the area, 9 of which are non-for-profit. 2 of which get their funding from either park districts or county, the county, DuPage County, and then 2 are municipally funded, ours and West Chicago. And I actually went online today and looked at West Chicago's budget. Their budget is $121,000. Ours will be in excess of $750,000. So I have a hard time believing that anybody within the city on the dais would say we're not adequately funding the museum. I'm challenging the museum to say, can you do more so that the taxpayers fund less? And then finally, on the subject of revenue, Mr. Bergeg, you mentioned a heightened awareness, and I'm happy to hear that, and I'm glad to hear that, and I don't doubt that. But what is disappointing to me is that revenue this year will be down. So in a year of heightened awareness, the revenue is down. And I don't see any goals, I don't see any outside-the-box thinking, I don't see any new methods by which the museum can generate revenue. And that's a concern to me. And then at the first time we talked about the museum budget 2 or 3 weeks ago, to find out that the credit card machine was down for at least 2 months, heightens that sense of that sense of concern that I have, that maybe revenue generation isn't as important to the museum staff as I think it should be. I'm not comfortable just saying the foundation, as hard as they work, should be the only way we generate revenue from the museum. Certainly that's an extremely important part, and I understand the way in which the foundation and the museum have to work together to generate those funds, and I appreciate and respect that work. But I still believe, and I firmly believe, that the museum itself, from what I'm calling museum operations, should be able to shoulder more of that expense burden. And I know that so revenue obviously is very important to me. That's not to suggest it's important to everybody up here. I know it's not. But there are other concerns from the dais, from other aldermen that I've talked to. To me, it comes down to the strategic plan. The strategic plan is something we've heard that's coming for at least 2 years. Some aldermen thinks it's actually a little bit longer than that, but as I recall, it's at least 2 years we've been told it's coming. Happy to hear that it's Q1 of next year, what's anticipated for completion. But I think it's very important that strategic plan get completed, and more importantly, get implemented. A little concerned about the amount of input received from various stakeholders, and that's something that obviously I need to get more involved with personally, because I think that's important if I'm going to get up here and preach, that I back it up and support and work with staff on some of these ideas. But I think it's important that strategic plan process come to a completion. So therefore, I'm going to move the following, and it's a 3-part motion. First, that the 2015 museum budget be reduced by $125,000, and that no account directly related to exhibits be reduced. Second, on or before July 1st, 2015, the appropriate committee of the City Council review the museum's strategic plan to ensure its completion and implementation, including goals for revenue generation from museum operations. And lastly, if the committee finds that the museum has completed and implemented the strategic plan with revenue generation goals, a report be submitted to the full City Council whereby the full $125,000 be added back into the museum budget.
Okay, we have a motion. Do I have a second for that motion? Alderman Leader seconds the motion. Discussion on the motion as read. Alderman Healy was kind enough to, before this meeting, provide me with a written copy, so I have the motion exactly as read. So I can clarify or answer any questions as it relates to the motion itself. But, conversation, we have a motion and a second. It is before the council.
Are you saying that that's all one?
Alderman Leader.
By recalling the past and freezing the present, a museum can open the gates of time. For that reason, I've always been a supporter of the Elmhurst Historical Museum. 4 years ago, I argued vainly against the decision to reduce the museum budget by $100,000. I have been very closely involved with the life of the museum since I represented the City Council during the strategic planning sessions of 2005 and 2006. My wife, who was originally a member of the Historical Commission, had been until very recently an active member and officer of the Elmhurst Heritage Foundation. There is little that has transpired at the museum over the last 10 years that we have not been knowledgeable about. Some very good things have happened in the last several years. Curator Lance Towser has performed miracles in a tiny space with very few actual dollars to produce popular, memorable, and moving exhibits that have gained national recognition and received prestigious awards. The new Elmhurst exhibit, to which Museum Director Berghager has also contributed much time and effort, promises to be exciting and interactive, though it will not actually increase exhibition space as it will replace the older and permanent exhibit. And of course, great credit must also go to the indispensable and energetic Elmhurst Heritage Foundation, now so ably led by Kathy Jordan. The museum would simply not be viable without their dedicated efforts. Please understand that the foundation is a private charity and has no voice in the operation or direction of the Elmhurst Historical Museum. The Elmhurst Historical Museum was founded in the late 1950s by a few dedicated volunteers. Today, it has 3 full-time and 6 part-time positions, and including the foundation, about 40 dedicated volunteers. Over the years, on average, the museum has devoted about 2% of its city budgets to exhibits. I'm at a loss to say what is more important to a museum other than exhibits. And in spite of the rapid growth of the museum payroll and costs, its exhibit space remains largely unchanged in 25 years. Exhibits, their quality and quantity are the driving force in creating attendance, excitement, interest, and revenue. They are the generator from which all positive benefits flow to the community. Now, admittedly, it is hard to quantify and qualify the economic and cultural benefits to the citizens of Elmhurst. Whatever positive advantages to the city, and I don't doubt there are a great many, the true cost of producing an exhibit as measured by the growth of payroll and other expenses has grown out of all proportion. It is like some perverted law of supply and demand. Payroll and operating expenses go up, supply of exhibit space stays the same, real cost of exhibits go up. It is also disturbing over the years the cost of off-site storage of artifacts. Too many, of dubious value, has soared to over $45,000 a year. It is time to take a serious inventory. It is time to cull out that which is worth saving as opposed to that which has little or no historical interest. It is time to slash the cost of rent receipts. The Elmhurst Historical Museum differs from all other city departments in that the driving force is artistic, creative, and imaginative, not the supply of a direct, tangible, and recognizable service. It is not a private business, and we do not hold it to the financial standards of a private business. We do not expect the museum to operate at a profit, but we do expect it to be operated in a far more cost-effective manner than at present. The council must use the power of the purse to give guidance to those who have the responsibility and authority for direction of the Elmhurst Historical Museum. And it's for those reasons and others, I support Alderman Healy's resolution.
Alderman Gutenkopf?
Oh, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have so many things to say. Why don't we start with collections?
As I'm sure you're going to direct your comments to the chair, I cannot wait.
I knew you'd be on the edge of your seat. So while one alderman ended comments with collections, another sort of started. So let me start there, because I think collections are always the central conundrum of how a museum operates. The history never stops. Museums have to keep collecting in order to have a depth and a breadth of material to draw from for exhibits and programs and documentation. This is the backstory to what museums do and why they are. That's why storage needs are always the most pressing issue of any museum. Where are we going to put these things? How do we decide what we collect? How do we care for them? So all of those questions are addressed by strong policies and procedures. The documents that outline why the museum exists and what it's going to do. And I'm really proud of Elmhurst because our museum has a clear set of guidelines that specifically identify what kinds of material are going to be added into the collections, what criteria the staff use to decide if they're going to happen. I'm sorry that Director Berghager used the phrase objects come in passively because it's really not a passive process. Although the museum does not actively go out into the community and knock on doors and say, we're looking to collect your bits specifically, when things do come to the museum, they're put through a rigorous analysis that starts with the questions of who used these objects and how and why and how do they specifically relate to the history of our community. What is it about this object that makes it worthy for us to keep? And the museum has been doing this rigorous examination of what objects it's going to bring into its care for a really long time. I mean, this has been going on almost, I can't say it's been going on as long as the museum existed, because I know the early years were less rigorous, and those materials have been culled from the collection. The museum has gone through this process of saying, what have we got? Why do we have it? Should we keep it? And how much does it cost for us to do so? And that happened over 20 years ago. And the collection was analyzed for just those things. But it doesn't mean that the collection didn't keep growing, because the story of Elmhurst keeps going. It keeps happening, and if the museum's going to do the right thing by talking about how the past informs the present, it has to have that depth of material in order to be able to do so. So I don't want us to think that the museum just sort of accepts everything that walks in the door. Plenty of things don't get past that first brush. The process of removing objects from the collection, as Mr. Berghager said, deaccessioning, is a deliberative legal process. Because once the museum says, yes, we're going to take your object, it has entered into a de facto contract with the people who have donated that material. The museum has said to those people, we promise that these objects that tell our story are going to stay here. And you'll be able to come back and see it, and we're going to be able to use it. And if you come knocking on our doors, we're always going to be able to find it. That's why record keeping at the museum is extensive. And there's some money in the budget related to that record keeping, because it's all electronic. And part of the annual audit process means that the museum's got to be able to put its hands on that stuff. So it's got to have a staff person who's in charge of keeping track of all of these items. That's one of those part-time staffers that we pay for. Removing an object from the collection has to go through sort of the reverse deliberation of accepting an object into the collection. And the museum has to make darn sure that there's a good reason that's outlined in that collections policy for why it's going to remove something from the collection. It can't just go in and say, you know what, we really don't need all of these items anymore. We're just going to get rid of them. When museums do that, attorneys general get involved. I think that it's really important from a budgetary standpoint for us to understand the full impact of the foundation's ability to raise money in this community because we're not seeing that in the museum's budget, and we can't discount it. We keep discounting it in these conversations. We keep talking about, well, okay, the foundation's raising a bunch of money, but that doesn't count. Of course it counts. People aren't donating their money to the city because of all those tax reasons I mentioned earlier, but it counts. All of those people that are donating money to the foundation are donating it to be used on behalf of the museum, and they are generating revenue for the city. And if we're going to look at what percentage of the museum budget goes towards staff salaries, we have to add in all that money the foundation's raising. And now the percentage of staff salaries drops from 50 to what, a third? I mean, is the foundation fundraising, the capital campaign, about equal to the museum's operating budget minus salaries and IT costs? So now all of a sudden it doesn't look so heavily skewed. But because we don't have a mechanism within the city for people to donate to us directly, they're donating to the foundation on behalf of the museum. The foundation can't do anything else with that money. They can't go out and buy pizza. They can't go give it to the art museum. They're using it for our museum. We made them do that. We set that up. If we cut the budget, we're losing all of this amazing momentum that they've been generating over the last 2 years. We lose the viability that Alderman Leader was talking about. We're gonna cut the budget, and every other piece of the operation of this department is going to go away, unless the intent of the budget cut is to remove staff. Are we intending that we're going to start firing staff because the city council has arbitrarily decided on a dollar amount to cut the museum budget? And if that's the case, the programs, those collections that you're all concerned about, the exhibits, the school activities, the Churchville School, which has been seeing a lot of activity of late, all of that's going to go away. And now all of the things that you say you're so interested in are going to stop. Or maybe this is just a backhanded way to cut a particular staff member. And if that's the case, then I think we're going about this in an incredibly disingenuous way. Because if you're not happy with the actions of any particular staff member, the way to handle that is to talk to their supervisor, because our job as a deliberative body, as this particular branch of government, is not to oversee the day-to-day activities of individual city employees. Our job is to oversee their boss. And if you don't think individual city employees are doing the job the best way that they possibly can, then you should be talking to their boss and using his annual evaluation as your opportunity to share your concerns. And ultimately, that boils down to, is their boss doing a good job? So let's not try to get at something deep inside a department that you might not think is functioning well in this manner, because it's not our job and it's not appropriate. Those are my thoughts on this whole process.
Motion?
Oh.
Those are your thoughts on the
On
motion?
the motion. Thank you. My thoughts on the motion to cut the budget.
Got it. Okay. Alderman Levin.
I think we'll wrap up the museum by 10:30, so on the motion.
I think we are on target for that.
Very good. We've talked about the museum quite a bit for the last couple of weeks, and I think particularly for the size of the budget. I've gone through and done some analysis myself to look at where the plan is and what's going on with the budget. When I look at the bottom line, I start from 2009 when I was a member of the Finance Task Force, and I remember speaking at that time about the budget and what the necessities were, essential city services, and we did cut the museum substantially at that time in terms of its overall budget level. And I remember my personal feeling at that time was that I think the target amount was somewhere around the $750,000 amount, that we were looking for increased revenues either through the foundation, through other revenue generating possibilities within the museum outside of the foundation. And when I look at the numbers as they go across, if I look at the total on page 167, if you multiply it times about 3% a year, I mean, I don't think anyone said there wasn't going to be a cost of living adjustment. And you multiply it out, and then you subtract the amount that the data processing allocation has gone up, not 3% a year, but it, you know, there's a huge jump there. And when I back out the data processing charge, instead of being, you know, if I would have constanted out at 3%, I see that, well, we're really within about $20,000 of where the budget was back in 2012. And when I do the same thing on page 166, line 10-1, the wages, or, you know, the subtotal, they're really not that much increased. Now, if I were building a city, I wouldn't build a museum. But we're not building a new city. We have a museum. It has a substantial collection. It has value. It's something that makes Elmhurst what it is. We're not a new city. We're not West Chicago. We're a bigger city. We have more. I look at the storage needs. We approved the lease renewal in 2011. So if we thought there were things that should have been cut and we didn't want to extend it, we could have taken less space then, and we can also look at it in 2016 when the lease is up. But there's really not a decision to make today because we're not giving up any space, it's there. I don't think that what we keep in that storage space this year is a critical budget issue. So deaccession, I like that word. I'm going to be doing some deaccessing tomorrow night. That's our garbage night here in Elmhurst. But for tonight, what I really see, I don't regard Alderman Healy's motion as directed at any staff person. I've known Alderman Healy long enough that he would be more direct if that were the case, directing my comments to the chair, of course. You know, I can support the budget, but not because I really think the motion, but not because I really think the museum budget's going to be reduced, because the way I heard Alderman Healy say it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is you said you want to reduce it now, you want to see that the plan gets done, and as long as there's no quantitative goal, you didn't say revenue has to go up by 10% or 5%, you just said it just has to address it. And if it does, the $125,000 comes back. So I see this motion as a means to make sure that A, the plan gets done, and B, that it at least talks about revenue generation. Is that correct, Alderman Healy?
That is correct.
Yes.
Yes. And so I guess I'm thinking about it, and I may well support the budget for the motion for that reason, but not because I am expressing any dissatisfaction with any staff member, not because I really expect the budget to be cut. If it does, then I think if that plan doesn't get done, then I do think there's a staff problem, but I think I regard it as a message. But I agree that the foundation is stepped up. That is the mechanism we've used to supplement funding, not to supplant funding, and those are my thoughts.
Alderman Polomsky.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm pleased that the museum's strategic plan is close to completion, and I was pleased to hear tonight that there will be an emphasis on regional draw. The Sox versus Cubs, Chicago Civil Wars, and Sweet Home Chicago are examples of two of those exhibits that bring new people to Elmhurst. And as we learned, these exhibits are capable of drawing diverse media attention through print and TV. But despite a captive audience of new visitors to Elmhurst like these, we aren't coordinating marketing efforts as well as we can to direct them to our shopping and dining districts. Changes in some museum operations and an updated approach to reaching museum visitors can provide opportunities for indirect sales and food and beverage revenue for our city. We're fortunate that the city as a whole will be working through the strategic planning process also, and we have the opportunity to plan how we can fully utilize the museum and certify our commitment to fostering its growth and recognition. A couple of years ago, Alderman York and I submitted a referral to align and improve the city's marketing efforts. And specifically, and this is quoted from the referral, improve community visibility and increase revenue associated with sales and food and beverage taxes. The museum plays a vital role in that visibility and provides great opportunity, which I hope to see reflected separately in the city's communication and marketing plan, as well as the museum's action plan. Solely to focus on the planning process, I think the time marker imposed by Alderman Healy's motion is an effective one. In addition, it provides a much-needed framework for the museum, and the execution of a well-designed plan allows the city to convey the message that Elmhurst isn't just a great place to live and work, but it's also a destination. Thanks.
Point of order, Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
I would like to get clarification or maybe a ruling on a part of this motion. The part of the motion being the reinstatement, if you will, of the, I believe the amount was $125,000. Part of the budget process is we either approve or modify or what have you, what the budget amount should be. I don't see on how we could say the amount should be X, but if they accomplish these goals, it will become Y. So I just want to make sure that it's, and no offense to the motion maker, but that it's a viable motion, because historically, we just vote yes or nay for a dollar amount for a budget line item, not a contingent in the future. with
So your
certain
point
criteria.
of order is his motion appropriate?
Well, the one section of the motion, correct.
Well, I believe his motion is in order, because ultimately, what would be reflected in the budget would be a reduction of $125,000. Now, the budget is something we have to have by ordinance. We have to have a budget, we have to vote on it, but it's just a planning document. Throughout the year, certainly, we can, if we want to, spend more money or less money and change the plan. So, as I see it, and correct me if I'm wrong, City Manager, the motion would be followed, if it passes, in that the budget, as we're discussing, would be reduced by $125,000. And then later on in the year, at some point, not later than, a committee would review a strategic plan, and therefore, the recommendation, I would assume, coming out of that committee would be to add $125,000 of spending.
So I guess that's.
So that's my point of order. My point of order is that it is in motion, is that his motion, as I see it, is asking for a reduction of $125,000. A recommendation coming out of committee of the whole to go to another committee is also appropriate. If you want to break these up, that's something that the motioner can do, but I think it's appropriate.
Understood. Making a motion to send something to committee, I agree, is appropriate, but the way I took it was almost, I don't know what the right way to.
There is no but or in a budget. So this is
I
a
agree.
cut of $125,000. That's what would be a result. Everyone understands that well, that's my ruling. You asked for a point of order. Yes, his motion is appropriate.
I just deemed that.
It's not debatable, actually, so,
Well, I
point of
was
order.
explaining my view.
Understand?
I just thought that would be a recommendation to a committee, not part of a motion. I think it clouds the motion.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Alderman Gutenkopf.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So, okay, so you've ruled that this is an appropriate motion, that we would be cutting the museum's budget by $125,000, so somewhere, somehow, they're gonna have to pull all that money out, which is pretty much just half of everything that they do everything they do is gonna get cut in half. If they finish this plan on time, then it's up to a committee to decide that the plan is finished, and the money would be reinstated, or it would come out of our general fund somewhere and get reinstated. So, at some point, is there any impetus to evaluate the efficacy of the plan, the quality of the plan, or they just have to hand in a plan? I mean, there's just so much about this that is practically confusing and fraught with questions that I would think that it would be very difficult to support the motion given all of the other pieces of, well, what is a plan? What is it? What should it look like? We haven't got a definition of a plan. Do they just hand in a document and say, here's our plan? And then if the committee decides that, well, okay, they finished the plan, they did what they were told, but we decide we don't like the plan, then they don't get the money back? How does all that work? I mean,
Look, that's not any further defined in Alderman Healy's motion, but that would be handled by the committee.
Well-
I'm not disagreeing that you don't have some points. I'm just saying the motion stands as is. And I mean, if you were
Right.
posing those rhetorical questions to the council, I get it.
I'm posing those questions because how can anybody possibly support this motion with all that stuff still hanging out there, saying, well, what's to prevent them from tomorrow putting a period at the end of the sentence and handing it in? We did it. Well, it's done. So if the point of the motion is to hang that little sword of Damocles over the museum, then, okay, I get it. You hung the sword. Can we, move on? We don't need it. What we're really trying to do, I think, is make sure that every department of the city is operating at the highest level possible. How does that happen? Not through this kind of a motion. That's not our job, to do it this way. Our job is to make sure that the city manager is getting the best out of his employees. If he's not getting the best out of his employees, then something is not working. It's not our job to threaten departments with budget cuts by making sure that little things happen. We've never done that before. We've never done it to any other department. We've argued the merits of projects that they've wanted to do. We've cut budgets. We cut the historic fire engine because we decided that it wasn't a priority for the city, remember? So that's an appropriate thing for us to do. We can point to line items in the budget and say, I'm not sure how this works. We need more detail about it. There's stuff coming up in the circle backs. But to just cut the budget that we keep cutting is just a way to try to get rid of the museum, no matter what Alderman Leader says about how much he loves it. Or it's an attempt to get rid of a staff person because that's the only place that the budget's got any particular leeway. And that's not our job either. Unless we're coming out and saying, look, okay, we've got to look for ways to cut staff. What have we done in the past? We've gone to the city manager and we've said, go back to your staffing and find places where you can restructure people's duties so that we can cut staffing citywide. We've never put a hit on staffing in any budget before.
Alderman Healy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You sit up here long enough and you hear all kinds of things and
Alderman Healy, let me jump in. I meant to jump in one or two comments ago and just say, I would certainly encourage all city council members to come to their own conclusions based on what they've heard. I would caution city council members to project assumptions of what has been said and what other people mean. I leave it up to each individual council member to evaluate what they've heard and make those decisions, and I would ask that you keep that in mind. Alderman Healy.
Thank you, Mayor, and that addresses what I was going to say. Sometimes the easy way to defeat something is to assign meanings to it that don't exist. The motion is pretty simple. Finish a process that staff has said will be completed in Q1, have it reviewed by a city council, or a committee of the city council, just like any strategic plan is or will be, and bring it to the city council for approval. It's that simple. If staff does that, and it goes to the committee, and the committee says, yep, that's an appropriate strategic plan, it comes before us and the money's put back in. As for technicalities as to how this would work, I would leave it to Marilyn Gaston and very capable city staff of how it would work from a budgeting standpoint. I'm very confident that will be done. But basically, if the money's taken out of the budget, it stays in the general fund, and if we put it back, it comes out of the general fund. The motion is the motion, it's fairly clear. Finish the strategic plan, include a couple things in it that I think we all agree we'd want to see, that staff themselves have said they're working on, and net effect is 0. That's in effect what this motion says, and that's all it says.
Alderman Levin?
You know, it's good debate. From a budgeting perspective, I do think there is a fallacy here, and that is, we passed a budget that has money in it. You cut 125 and it's not there. So there's a level of complexity of, you've got to put it somewhere else. It's got to be in a contingency fund. Because if it's not there, you can't put it back. You know, otherwise you have to open up the budget process again. The budget sets forth everything that's supposed to be there. Now, you can budget the money, and you can, I don't know if I'm more familiar with the state level, where there are contingencies that can't, you know, it's budgeted, but it's not authorized to be spent. I don't know if that's what we do in the municipality or not. But as I hear the debate now, I hear two things. One is, I don't really want to cut the budget. I want there to be the strategic plan finished. That is what the goal is. And it seems like the same thing could be accomplished, because it's heard loud and clear, and I don't think any of the aldermen are saying they don't want the strategic plan. The motion, I mean, staff is here, I think they hear it, that if it's not done by a date certain, the money's not going to be there. So the money can be in the budget, and it can be cut, or it can be not authorized at some future point. But I do think there's a problem with taking money out of the budget, because then we are going to make a levy based upon what we are budgeting, and the levy will not include that unless we get to another level of complexity where it goes into some other line item, a contingency fund or something else. I think the better, and I also think there's a dangerous message. We're sending a message to staff that is, you darn well better get the plan. I mean, I think that's what everyone's saying. But I'm also concerned about the message we send to the foundation, to the community, that we're cutting $125,000 when that message is going to get garbled when it gets out there. So I think there's a better way to do this.
Let me ask, at this point, I think it's appropriate to ask staff, if the motion passed as is, to the best of my knowledge, we don't have a if-then go-to clause in our budget. If the motion passes as is, I assume that the budget would reflect a reduction somewhere in the line, in general fund, you know, 166 and 167, I assume there would be a reduction that we would vote on when this budget gets presented in its final form 3 weeks from now. Is that correct? If the motion passed as is.
As I understand the motion, it would be for the general fund dollar amount to be $125,000 less than what it states right now. That money, in talking to Marilyn, that money would still remain in the general fund surplus and could be transferred in as a revenue in a budget amendment later in the process, if that's what the council approves.
Clear?
No.
No?
No.
Would there be a reduction on page 167, at the bottom of second to last column, 2015 projected? Right now, it's 882,770. Would there be a reduction in that line item of $125,000?
Just be by line. Mayor, my question is, doesn't it have to be by line item? You can't just reduce the bottom number, you have to.
No, I understand that. Ultimately, that was implied in my question, is that the sum total of the reduction would be, I can cross it out right now and reduce it by 125.
You're correct, Mayor.
Okay, so that is
accounts
what-
would have to be adjusted to get to a new bottom line.
Yes,
Page
all the
167.
line items somewhere, somehow, would be looked at. Whatever reductions you felt needed to be made for the budget that we would vote on in, let's just call it 3 weeks, would result in a total museum dollar amount reduced by 125,000.
That's how I
I
understand
have
the
a
motion.
practical question.
Alderman Healy?
Thank you, Mayor. And I'd just like to give a little of my thought process and why the motion is structured the way it is, with taking it out now and putting it back in later, as opposed to leaving it in and taking it out on July 1st if criteria weren't met. Doing it this way, staff doesn't have to make any cuts if they intend on hitting the target come July 1st. There's enough money in the budget to meet all of its obligations, to pay all the salaries, to do everything they need to do, as long as they intend to hit the goal of July 1st, at which point we put the money back in, no cuts are made, there's enough money there to spend in the total budget, even after the reduction, to get them through to July 1st, or even into August. The problem with doing it the other way, as Alderman Levin, I think, suggested, is leave it in the budget and take it away. If we do that effective July 1st, they have to make cuts immediately, where this gives staff time to plan, to make sure that they're gonna hit the budget, the target, and they have nothing to worry about. Now, if the target's not hit, they have to make cuts, but at least they can plan accordingly. If we leave it in the budget and then have to cut, they have to make almost immediate cuts, and that's what we don't wanna, I don't wanna have happen. Now, as far as getting the message that this is important and we want it done, yeah, that, in a nutshell, is the intent of the motion. We've heard, at least for 2 years, that the plan was coming. That several of us, I won't say all of it, but many of us have voiced concerns to various people on some things we'd like to see handled differently at the museum. And I believe the strategic plan, once complete, will at least address those concerns. It's not to say that I'm gonna get as much revenue generation as I want, may not, but at least it'll be in the plan and part of the process for staff to execute moving forward. That's really what we're trying to do here. In terms of how the motion's structured, I think it's fair. I think it gives staff plenty of time to react and plan accordingly, and we go from there.
Alderman Bram?
Thank you. I think the intent here for this motion is about sending a message, and I'm not speaking for Alderman Healy, I'm speaking for myself, sending a message, or my understanding of the motion at least, sending a message of the council has been patiently waiting for the strategic plan to answer some very pressing concerns and questions over what's going on at the museum, revenue generated, dollars spent, et cetera. I differ from the approach here. I think the message has been sent and heard loud and clear. I don't think there's a necessity, though, to, at least at this time, to reduce the budget for the museum in any line item or all of the above. I voiced my concerns over the storage capacity and how much dollars we spend and what we have in our collections. And all, as Alderman, I almost said Healy, Alderman Levin has stated, we are in the middle of that lease, and I understand and respect that. But I think that is a message that I was trying to send, that I would like, at least, if it is documented to some degree, but I would like data or some type of way for me to further understand on how well we scrutinize our collections. So I can't support this motion. I think staff has heard loud and clear that there's serious concerns of why the strategic plan is not already completed. If we have confidence in staff that they will have it done by July 1st, I don't find any reason to reduce the budget and then overspend that budget line item to accomplish that goal. It would be different same time next year if the strategic plan still hasn't been reviewed and moved forward, but at this time I don't support this motion.
Any other comments as it relates? Alderman York?
Thank you, Your Honor. It has been interesting listening to the debate this evening, and as somebody who totally respects and understands the work that the foundation does, I appreciate the fact that you guys are sitting through this, and really, at Alderman Healy's suggestion, this is not any dig on you folks or the funding that you provide, and I'm happy to be a part of it. From a finance perspective, I understand where Alderman Healy is coming from, and I think there's at least a few cases, the City of Elmhurst financial staff does a wonderful job of planning, probably to a fault, to the point that we plan, and in 99% of the cases, we probably over budget what we're going to spend. There have been times in the past where an item has come up and the budget has been $1 and we spent $1.50, and we figure out a way to get that done. As somebody, and I've lost track of all the comments that have been made here, but as somebody suggested, if the committee that reviews a strategic plan looks at it and renders their opinion that the criteria of the motion have been met, we can restore the spending. We will have spent a few more dollars on the Historical Museum this year than was in the budget. We have a budget surplus, we have a general fund surplus that accounts for these types of things to happen. If we were to put things in contingency, for example, snowstorms, we have more snowstorms than we have money in the contingency. We don't stop plowing the snow when the taxi meter hits, the full mark on the contingency item. So I don't have an issue with proper vetting of the motion, the strategic plan, and then the reinstatement of the revenues to take care of those expenses. I don't think that's terribly concerning, at least in my opinion. Thank you.
Alderman Dunn, then I'll go to Alderman Toledo.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Looking at past expenditures for the Historical Museum, noticed similar things as Alderman Levin, that there's been just a gradual increase, which is perfectly acceptable and understandable given that costs do increase. Can we take a little bit of cost out? We could probably take a little bit, but I don't think significantly. As far as revenue goes, I think one of the aldermen mentioned perhaps 20% revenue from potentially being captured at the gate. Certainly, we're nowhere near that. I saw a statistic where there was about 10,000 people coming through the museum somewhere, and if we charged them each $10 each, that would only be $100,000. It's not we're not going to get rich in this business. I'm convinced that this is a $900,000 enterprise. It's about that much to manage the operations of the city. The foundation, I think, reached an agreement with the city where the city would generally cover the operational costs, and the foundation would be supporting expansion, new exhibits, and growth within the museum, and they're doing a great job of that, and going over and above it and kicking in some additional funds for some of the operating expenses when things got lean. So I believe this is, as I mentioned, a $900,000 enterprise for the city. I don't see it being valid to cut $125,000 at this point, whether it's put off to the side to come back later. I do, however, feel that there's been a lot of work on the strategic plan. I like what I see in it. I'm pretty comfortable with the museum staff, the city staff, and the support that the foundation will give to get that done. So I don't believe it's appropriate to hang that contingency out there now. I'm comfortable with the budget as is, and I would recommend that we move forward with it as is. Thank you.
Alderman Toledo.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a clarifying question for yourself, Your Honor, or some of the staff. Before I place a vote on this, given this is my first time going through the budget, someone did mention the tax levy and how that might interact with this if a cut is made in terms of having enough funds to run. Could someone clarify how the tax levy would be impacted, if at all, if $125,000 was taken out of this area of the budget?
Tax levy, our tax levy and our budget coincide in terms of the timing, so shortly we'll be voting on our tax levy, which is the total dollar amount that we decide what we're going to tax. This is technically a cut, but I think that the tax levy as it sits before Alderman York's, actually, your committee, I think that this motion, should it pass, and with the understanding that $125,000 will probably be put back in, would be taken into account to the tax levy. So the tax levy's not going to be voted on, it's going to be a separate vote than the budget. Your committee will consider what that tax levy should be, and I am certain that this conversation will be part of it. Is that a fair
Absolutely.
way of putting it, Alderman York?
Absolutely.
So, hope that answers your question. Okay. Any other questions or comments as it relates to Alderman Healy's motion? Alderman Gutenkopf.
This is a practical question.
I'm sorry, I didn't?
I'm sorry, this is just a sort of a practical question. If we cut the budget so that some of the budgeted items hit zero, does that mean that the museum is not able to spend in those budget lines? Or do they spend in those budget lines and we just recognize that they're going over budget? I mean, it's just practically,
No,
how
I
does that
understand the
work?
question. I think it's really a staff question. City Manager Grabowski, certainly, as I said, there's no if-then portion of the budget. So the net result of this would be, at the very least, the budget we're looking at would be a cut of $125,000 in what we're voting on. I understand staff would have to get very creative in how to figure this out and then put it back in. I know it's putting you on the spot because you're not planning for this right now. And should it pass, you have to go back and figure out how to make it fit. Can you add any thoughts to Alderman Gutenkopf's statement?
It's certainly a unique challenge that we've been given, if it passes. What we've done in the past, while certain lines have gone over, it's generally been a bottom line that we've stuck to for any individual department. These are more or less guidelines, so I guess, yes, it could be if the line was zeroed out. I'm not exactly sure how we're going to do that just yet.
Okay, so it's just so I understand. So a line might get zeroed out because there's an awful lot of little bitty lines in here, and something is going to give, but an expense may have to hit that line because it has to be coded to that line to pass the audit. So it would just go over the budget at that point.
In just briefly conferring with Marilyn, it'd be unlikely that we would take any line down to zero for that reason.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions or comments before we vote on the motion? All right, I'm going to read the motion on your behalf, Clerk Spencer.
Thank
You
you.
good with that? All right, we have a motion by Alderman Healy and a second by Alderman Leader that the 2015 museum budget be reduced by $125,000 and no account directly related to exhibits is reduced. Second part of the motion, on or before July 1st, 2015, the appropriate committee of the City Council review the museum's strategic plan to ensure its completion and implementation, including goals for revenue generation from museum operations. So far correct, Alderman Healy?
Dead on.
Third, and lastly, if the committee finds that the museum has completed and implemented the strategic plan with revenue generation goals, a report will be submitted to the full City Council whereby the full $125,000 be added back into the 2015 museum budget. We have a motion and a second on that. Debate has concluded. I will ask Clerk Spencer to please call the roll as it relates to the motion as read.
Healy.
Aye.
Leader.
Aye.
Palumski.
Aye.
Graham.
No.
Toledo.
Aye.
York.
Aye.
Levin.
No.
Conquest,
Aye.
Kennedy,
Aye.
Mulliner,
No.
Wagner,
Aye.
Gutenkopf,
No.
Deuter,
No.
Dunn.
No.
Looks like 8 ayes and 6 nays.
8 ayes, 6 nays, motion passes.
Is it, point of order, Mr. Mayor, is that simple majority on?
Yeah, this is simple majority. This is just a motion within committee of the whole.
But it's budget related, so I was just inquiring if it was.
No, it's simple majority.
Is it?
City manager, you have some challenges before you. Do you have any questions, or have you heard enough as it relates to this?
I think we understand
Okay.
where we stand.
It's 10 after 10, and we've had quite a meeting. I'm seeing some folks saying they've had enough. Seeing some agreement, yes.
Oh.
I think it's been a long night. I'm getting some nods. I am going to cut the meeting short by about 20 minutes, give us a break, and I'm going to ask for a motion to adjourn. Motion by Alderman York, second by Alderman Deuter. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We're adjourned. Thank you very much.